All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this rainy morning in Philadelphia. I think we're ready to get started. My name is Maia Otarashvili. I am the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Program here at FPRI. Again, I would like to thank you, all of you, for joining us today. I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion. I am joined by two of FPRI's Baltic Sea Fellows. Una Bergmane is a teaching fellow at London School of Economics, and she holds a PhD from Sciences Po Paris. She has a book coming up, which is called Politics of Uncertainty, the US, the Baltic Question, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union. Thank you for joining us today, Una. Indra Ekmanis is also with us. She's also our Baltic Sea Fellow, and I'm delighted to say that she's the editor of FPRI's Baltic Bulletin this year, which has been a really lovely experience. Indra is the editor of The World for Public Radio's The World. She holds a PhD in International Studies from the University of Washington. This event was organized to celebrate and promote our special summer issue of FPRI's scholarly journal, Orbis. We dedicated it to 20 years of Putinism and invited some of our brightest scholars to write articles for it. It was just published, and Chris Miller and I were invited to be co-editors of this issue. So throughout July, you will see quite a few events that Chris and I will be moderating and talking to a lot of the contributors for this issue. So let's go ahead and get started. I think we have, everybody has come in now. So Una, let's start with you. I want to get a sense from you, an overview of Russia's relations with the Baltic States, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's sort of set the stage for our talk today.
Yeah, thank you, Maya. Thank you very much for organizing this. And I think it's great that we can manage to stay connected in these uncertain times and to continue the discussions online. Yeah, I think that if we want to understand the relations between Russia and the Baltic states today, and also many of the problems that the Baltic societies face, these multi-ethnic societies face, then we have to think about look in the past and look what happened at the beginning of the Second World War, and then during the Soviet occupation, and then of course what happened in the 90s and early 2000s. And as you know, probably, hopefully, that the Baltic states, they were independent between the two world wars. And in the 1940s, they were occupied and illegally annexed by the Soviet Union. And that is one of the sources of tensions between the Baltic states and Russia today, because the official position of Russia is that this annexation was legal, while the Baltic states and the international community all through the Cold War insisted that this annexation was illegal because it was carried out through threat of force and coercion. The Soviet experience, I could talk for a long time, what was the experience of the Baltic nations in the Soviet Union. But I think one important thing to mention, without going into too many details, is that during the Soviet period, starting from the 60s, the 70s, there was a very high number of migrants arriving in Estonia and Latvia, not so much in Lithuania, from other Soviet republics. And so that was basically, to a certain extent, the beginning, the creation of these large ethnic Russian-speaking communities in the Baltic states, even though there was a smaller Russian minority even before the Second World War. But the biggest part of the Russian-speaking minorities basically arrived in the Baltic states in the Soviet period. The time of the collapse of the Soviet Union was a moment for hope in many different ways, but also in terms of a hope that there might be a cooperation in the future between the newly independent Baltic states and a Russian Federation, because in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a solidarity and there was a cooperation between the so-called Russian Democrats, so the circles of Boris Yeltsin, and these emerging elites in the Baltic states, the activists of the independence movement. But unfortunately, these solidarities basically disappeared in the 90s for many different reasons. On one hand, it was the chaos of the 90s in Russia. On the other hand, those were decisions that were made in the Baltics, the very restrictive citizenship laws that were adopted in Estonia and in Latvia. So not everybody who arrived in the Soviet period in the Baltic states became automatically a citizen. The decision of the Baltic parliament was, Estonian, Latvia, and Lithuania went a different direction, was that there had to be exams that people would have to pass in order to obtain citizenship, those people who arrived during the Soviet period. So that was one of the big sources of tensions between Estonia, Latvia, and Russian Federation. The other huge source of tension, obviously, was Baltic decision to join EU and NATO. And that was basically a crucial turning point in the history of Russian-Baltic relations, because it showed a very clear determination to escape the Russian zone of influence. And the Baltic states were successful in joining both NATO and the EU in 2004. Since the arrival of Putin 20 years ago, ironically, we can say that the Russian influence has diminished since the early 2000s. Why? Well, firstly, because the Baltic states joined the EU and NATO, but also this slowly fading Russian influence. It has been a lot of Russian own doing. For example, even though the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004, it did not immediately mean arrival of NATO troops in the Baltic states. The NATO troops arrived after Russian aggression and annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine in 2014. So basically, the current increased NATO presence in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, it is a reaction of something that was done and decided in Moscow. The other important thing I think that we have to mention is the decrease of Russian influence because of internal developments in the Baltic states. And especially I can think about Latvian example, where the change of political culture, the decrease of influence of corrupted politicians, the ongoing fight against corruption has also diminished the ways how Russia can influence the situation in the Baltic states. And Indra will talk more about Russian communities in Estonia and in Latvia. But there has often been a perception that these Russian communities are the weakest link in the Baltic societies and that they can be instrumentalized by Moscow to somehow destabilize the situation in the Baltics. And obviously, yes, it could eventually be done, but another risk factor, and in my perception, an even much more important risk factor for the Baltic societies, have been the corrupted political elites that were very strong in the 90s and who had very good business links and working relations and networks with Moscow. They are the ones who actually, as I said, in my perception, are the weakest link. And luckily, since the early 2000s, their influence, because of the change of the political culture, has diminished. So I think that would be, for now, a summary of the main points of these relations.
Thank you. Yes, I think that was a really nice overview. And I want to turn to Indra so we can delve specifically into this issue of Russian-speaking minorities. Based on what Una just told us, this notion of Latvia or Estonia being the next Crimea, it sounds blown out of proportion, right? Yet at the time, and even right after the annexation of Crimea for a while, we were all worried. So Indra, can you walk us through this issue of the Russian-speaking minorities, and also tell us a little bit about, why are they so dangerous, right? I'm obviously being funny here, but I think your work, especially in this Orbis article, has really debunked a lot of these myths. So I would love for our audience to hear a little bit more from you about it.
Yes, can you hear me now? Good. Yeah, thank you, Maya, and thank you, Una, for that great overview of the kind of historical context, especially when we're thinking about Russia and Russian influence in the Baltic states. And thank you to Maya and FPRI for having us both to discuss these issues. Yeah, so the Russian-speaking communities in the Baltic states, especially in Latvia and Estonia, as Una mentioned, in Lithuania, the situation is a little bit different, have very frequently become these kind of hot-button communities, especially coming from a foreign media perspective. The figures are kind of are daunting, right? A third of the populations, more or less, of Latvia and Estonia speak Russian as their native language or their first language. Some 25% of the populations are ethnically Russian, and around a little bit, but 6 to 11% of those populations are also considered non-citizens. So people who are under, in some ways, protection of the state, but are not do not have full access to voting or political office rights. So from a sort of numbers perspective, this looks pretty daunting. And in some ways, it is, as Una kind of laid out for us, a situation of the Baltic's own making. In some ways, the restrictive citizenship policies of the 1990s served to, in some ways, disenfranchise a large swath of the population. You can make arguments on, I think, both sides of the coin, the legality of the citizenship policies based on the continuity of the interwar Baltic states. And you can make arguments perhaps on the other side of the practicalities of doing that, or the kind of short-sighted thinking of what would happen in the future. I think in the 1990s, there was this idea that by creating these sort of restrictive policies, you would encourage a large swath of this population to repatriate to Russia in some ways, or to other states. So that didn't happen, and now we have these percentages that again look very very scary in the foreign media. But if you start to go to Latvia or to Estonia and to kind of live in an everyday sort of situation, what you will see is perhaps a little bit different. There certainly are Russian-speaking populations. There are areas of the Baltics where Russian is the first language. I conducted a lot of my field work in Daugavpils and Daugavpils municipality, which is this southeastern area of Latvia in Latgale. And it is very often kind of pointed to as this potential hotspot, and both Una and I in our articles reference the BBC BBC Two film Into the War Room, which kind of lays out this potential kind of conflagration that begins in Latgale and Daugavpils, based on the idea that there are Russian separatists that are being agitated by the Russian Federation. But if you go to Daugavpils or to the surrounding countryside, perhaps what you would see is something quite different, which is just people living their daily life. And this is an aspect of the discussion on integration that is usually glossed over. It is very easy for us to count the instances of sort of tension, for us to count instances of a non-reciprocal kind of language usage, demonstrations or protests around certain hot button issues, for example, education or language or citizenship. But it is much, much harder to see kind of the way that people interact on an everyday basis. And that also is part of part of the story of integration. I think part of the story of why as Una mentioned, there is not Russia is not particularly successful in kind of stirring up the pot by virtue of the Russian-speaking communities. This idea of Ruski Mir, right, is also a big question, the idea of the Russian compatriot policy, where Russia kind of lays claim in some ways to all of its Russian-speaking compatriots in the near abroad, beyond Russia's borders, whether or not those countries like it or not. That idea has kind of fizzled out on a very grassroots level. It's an elite sort of more of an elite perspective, but on an everyday basis, people are going about their daily lives and are integrating in these very minute or bigger ways. Maybe it is that people will code switch into an alternate language. This happens both ways, right? Maybe it is that they are participating in their local civics club, in their local choir. They're singing songs in Latvian or Estonian, or they are dancing with their fellow teenagers in folk dance groups or things like this. And I would like us to be careful of pigeonholing people into one specific identity. I had this, some research with the Polish gymnasium in Daugavpils several years ago, and I asked them this kind of question, teenagers, and how do you see yourself? You are Polish, you're living in Daugavpils, you're living in Latvia. And they kind of looked at me in this like quizzical way and said, well, okay, yeah, so we speak Polish with our grandparents, we speak Russian with our friends, and at school we speak Latvian, and when we go to represent our country, we are representing Latvia in our folk dance groups or whatever. So there are multiple layers of identities, and especially among youth, I think that it's very important for us to disassociate the idea of Russian nationality with some sort of, or Russian ethnicity or Russian language with the country itself, or this idea that speaking in Russian is an automatic indicator of someone's loyalty, or speaking in Latvian is an automatic indicator of someone's loyalty. It's far more complicated than that. There are so many other layers that we have to think about. And so I guess I would leave it there to just say that we have to complicate the idea of what a Russian-speaking community is and what kind of role that they can play, because it is not a monolithic group, and we shouldn't think of it as such.
Right, and it's not necessarily there to invite annexation anytime soon.
I mean, exactly. Another quick point in that is that economically, you can just, especially if you're on a border, you can look over the border and you can see the situation, the opportunities that are part of this European economic integration, political integration, security integration, and very quickly see that perhaps you don't have necessarily an easy life, but your positionality and the situation that you're in is perhaps much stronger as part of Europe than it is as part of Russia.
Thank you. I want to encourage our participants to use the chat feature and send in questions. I will try to attend to as many of them as I can. I want to give a shout out to Ruta Sapetis, who is among our participants. She's one of my favorite historical fiction writers who happens to be of Lithuanian descent, and she sent us a question. She says, if there is time, please discuss this in case of Lithuania. And let me add to that another layer. Why won't we speak for Lithuania? Why won't we sort of look a bit more at disinformation, cybersecurity issues. Yes, not all three countries have the same number of Russian-speaking minorities, but one of the number one ways we have seen a lot of vulnerability in the Baltics, and we've seen actually a lot of success stories in combating this, is in terms of cybersecurity, propaganda, disinformation, all of this emanating from Russia. So I want to turn to Una and then Indra, if you'd like to comment on that. I think you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. Those are great questions. Regarding Lithuania, so the Lithuanian situation was different and is different in the sense that during the Soviet period, Lithuania did not experience a massive immigration from other Soviet republics for many different reasons that probably I will not go into the details, but the situation was that at the end of the 80s, Lithuania was homogeneous, ethnically rather homogeneous country with a small Russian minority and a small Polish minority. And that enabled Lithuania to adopt a very inclusive citizenship law. Basically, people living at the time in Lithuania, regardless of the time period when they arrived in Lithuania, they were able to obtain citizenship. While in this case of Latvia and Estonia, because of the number of people who had recently arrived in Estonia and Latvia, those numbers were so high. And also for different political reasons at the time, it was decided that the automatic citizenship will, people who were citizens in the 20s and the 30s during the first independence and their descendants will automatically become citizens, and everybody else will have to pass a language exam and a history exam. So in that sense, Lithuanian situation was easier, and the citizenship laws were much more inclusive in Lithuania. The second question was about the cybersecurity. So that's obviously a very important question in all three Baltic states. I think that Estonia has taken this question, has started to think about these issues earlier and in a much more serious way. And that is because in 2008, Estonia experienced large-scale cyber attacks originating from Russia. That was in the context, probably you remember, in the context of the so-called Bronze Soldier Crisis. There was a monument and the Second World War cemetery. Well, not really a cemetery, but a monument with a couple of graves in the center of Tallinn, commemorating the Soviets who liberated Tallinn from the Nazis. But that, again, of course, is a controversial issue because they not only liberated Tallinn from the Nazis, but they stayed there for the coming decades. And so the removal of the Bronze Soldier started a crisis in Estonia for the first time in the history since the renewal of independence in the Baltic States. There was actual violence and riots of some part of the Russian speakers. And at the same time, Estonia experienced very serious cyber attacks against its institutions, banks, and they were originating from Russia. So ever since then, Estonia has taken very seriously the question of cybersecurity. And the other two Baltic states are, of course, following the Estonian example.
Now let's turn to Indra. Let's turn to you. Thank you so much for that answer, Una.
I think that probably Una has covered it mostly. Unless you want to give me another perspective of the question, I'll be happy to answer that.
All right. So we have a lot of really great questions from our audience. So thank you everybody for being so active. I have a question from Alvar Susar. He wants to know, how has the emergence of populist parties taking up ethnic politics change the perceived risks by the minority Russian communities of persecution, leading to an invitation for help from Mother Russia. So maybe you would like to take this one, Indra.
Sure. So I think this has been a defining sort of feature of at least the Latvian political landscape, and probably to some extent in the other Baltics as well, for quite some time, is this kind of division on ethnic lines versus actually on kind of political platform. And so what you have had for the last now 30 years more or less is kind of coalitions that are based on kind of ethnic directions versus cohesion around political ideology, left, right, or center. So you have, you think now in the coalition, a very progressive party and a very sort of far-right nationalist party, or at least nationalist party. So this is not something particularly new, and in fact, you know, the populist party, KPVLV, Kampie der Valsts, had quite a successful electoral showing, but it has not necessarily succeeded in a kind of illiberal turn that has happened in other places in other countries in the region. Do populist parties perhaps increase the risk of Russian communities feeling persecution? But perhaps more so, I'm not an expert in Estonia. I would hesitate to comment too much on the Estonian political situation, but perhaps this can be seen a little bit more. But I think that in general, the kind of political persecution that is often pointed to, it has been kind of underlying the kind of political context for a while. Again, it's around citizenship, it's around language, it's around education, and as we've seen, the kind of draw of the larger Russian-speaking population to kind of activate or mobilize on these kinds of questions is becoming less and less. For example, this kind of switch to all Latvian language and education in minority schools, with the exception of minority topics or minority subjects, has drawn much less ire from the actual population than it did in the early 2000s, when there was a similar shift to teaching more in the national language rather than in minority languages in these schools. Of course, these things are kind of fomented by activists, and of course you can pluck at kind of the divisions in society, but I think it's also important to consider that in many cases, Russian-speaking communities and Baltic-speaking communities have the same sort of frustrations or desires from their government, right? So, you know, they're thinking about childcare, the quality of their education, the affordability of healthcare, and not everything is kind of framed around these ethnic issues, which I think is also kind of important context.
Absolutely, thank you for that. So I have a question from Paul Sparks, who says, is the NATO status and the almost continual presence of American troops in Latvia a guarantee that Russia would not intervene via civil unrest or mercenaries? This actually brings up sort of the elephant in the room, right? We cannot be talking about Baltic security issues, Baltic-Russia relations, without bringing up NATO's Article 5. This has been, again, one of the biggest points of difference among many NATO experts. So Una, can you sort of talk to us a little bit about NATO's Article 5 in terms of its relevance to the Baltic Sea region, but also specifically again to this potential Russian threat?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's the key, that to a certain extent was the key motivation for the Baltic states to when they decided to join NATO, was Article 5, so the idea that attack against one of the member states should be considered as an attack against all of the member states. Then, of course, even after the Baltic states joined NATO, the question has always been, how would that happen practically if, for some reason, there actually was a Russian attack against the Baltic states? So how quickly, in what way, how efficiently would NATO be able to react? And the Baltic states have always wanted to have a substantial NATO presence in the Baltic states. And at first, after the Baltic states joined NATO, the only form of NATO presence was in the Baltic states was the air policing, which is done on rotation basis by different NATO member states. And then, as you know, after the annexation of Crimea, after the Russian war in eastern Ukraine, NATO decided that there has to be a permanent rapid response troops in the Baltic states. So there are two things. There is an ongoing, constant cooperation between the U.S. Army and Department of Defense and the Baltic states, and then there are these rapid response battalions, multinational battalions in the Baltic states, led in Lithuania. These multinational battalions are led by Germany, in Latvia by Canada, and in Estonia by the UK. And so that's an important component, that this is not just the US presence in the Baltic states. The NATO troops that participate in the US troops that participate in exercises, but they are not the only ones. The permanent presence is coordinated by different NATO member states. Is that a deterrent? It obviously is. I wouldn't like to oversimplify and exaggerate and to say that Russia was thinking about invading the Baltic states, and then because of NATO presence, they decided not to. We actually don't know what is the perception of the Baltic states in Moscow. But obviously the presence of foreign troops complicate the situation for Russia. And of course it is a deterrent. It also shows the seriousness and how the extent to which Article 5 is taken seriously by the NATO member states. And I think it's also something that is just reassuring for Baltic societies to have NATO troops in the Baltic states. And it is a tangible and visible proof for many people in the Baltic societies that the Baltic states are actually NATO member states and that they are protected by the Article 5.
Right. So last year, I'm sure you're aware, Lithuania, the government of Lithuania and their intelligence agencies announced that China was one of the greatest threats to Lithuania alongside Russia. They said it was due to China's malicious use of Chinese cyber capabilities in Lithuanian cyberspace. And as you may remember, it caused a lot of upheaval and a lot of disagreements between the two sides. I bring this up because we have a question from one of our attendees. I'm sorry, I have just lost that question, but it was about, what is China's role in Latvia? How do they see China there? My colleagues from FPRI and I spent some time in Vilnius last year, and we had a conference exactly on this issue. The role of China in the Baltics obviously is a newcomer, and there are many unknowns. But can you talk to us, either of you or both of you, how is China perceived in Latvia, and what is its role there right now?
Indra, do you want me to take you? Do you want to go?
I won't presume to be able to answer that question in any depth.
No, I think that is indeed true, and these are extremely important questions, the presence of China, activities of China in the Baltic countries. And the presence is real, and China's interest in the Baltic countries it's a tangible interest. It does not mean that China would be particularly interested in the Baltic states, that would be some sort of a Chinese priority. It's far from that. It just means that as part of its interest in the European Union, China is interested in what is happening in the Baltic states. So obviously there is activities and Chinese intelligence gathering in the Baltic states. Also because these are NATO member states. So for China, Baltic states are interesting as members of the EU, members of NATO, probably especially as members of NATO. The perception in Latvia, in the Baltic states, in Latvia a little bit less probably as in Lithuania, because as Maia mentioned, there was a very public debate about these issues in Lithuania, not so much in Latvia. The perception and the society is less sensitive to the Chinese possible presence in the Baltic states because it doesn't have the same historical background as Russia. And I think that is the big difference, that there is no background of Latvian-Chinese relations, neither good nor bad. There is nothing for people to refer to. Obviously, there is a negative image of China as a communist country, an authoritarian regime, human rights abuses, but it's still a faraway country in Asia that doesn't have there's no historical experience of interaction with China. So in that sense, to a certain extent, the Chinese task is easier than the Russian task because the society is less sensitive. But then, of course, the intelligence services, the state security services in the Baltic states are aware of this, and they are following whatever is happening from that perspective.
Thank you. I have another question. This one is from Kevin Platt, our colleague at University of Pennsylvania. He wants to know, could the speakers talk about the Latvian party system and the degree to which it maps onto ethno-linguistic divides or not, as well as prospects for achieving a situation in which party politics would be largely free of ethnic identifications? Who would like to take this one?
Well, I will start. Maybe when I can add more. I mean, I think that right now the idea of the ethno-linguistic divide is advantageous, more so for the political parties themselves than it is perhaps for the voting populace. It becomes a kind of a hot point, easier to campaign on some issues like this, especially when you on the far left and the far right. Far left, primarily not politically far left, but more thinking about the Saskaņas centrs or Harmony Center in Latvia and National Alliance in Latvia. Also on the far right, these it becomes easy to kind of whip up these hot button issues, that we're always talking about, especially when it comes to integration. That being said, there are movements. Harmony Center or Harmony has ethnic Latvians on their party list. They have appealed in a sort of populist way to ethnic Latvians, especially older Latvians in their Riga elections. So the idea that ethnic politics is beneficial. I think it's primarily beneficial to the party system itself, right? It allows you to kind of look away from kind of the more pressing issues that kind of require more work or more intensive sort of political discussions around how you're going to fix a problem. So moving to be able to move forward, I don't know. I mean, I think that we have to have a political system that is, or a political will to address more of these complex issues that doesn't turn necessarily to left or right or to ethnicity or to language. And that being said, that happens, right? Like we are talking about other issues too. So we can't only talk about politics in the Baltics as part of an ethnic issue, because it's not, because we are, it is a much broader range, and we should be wary also of kind of painting it with this sort of ethno-linguistic brush. But maybe Una can speak a bit more.
Yeah, no, so talking about Latvia, I think it's a very interesting moment, because as Indra said, for a very long time, it was perceived that we have one big Russian speakers party, which is Harmony Center. Since 2010, it has been perceived as the main Russian speakers party. And even though they have been successful in parliamentary elections, they have never been part of the ruling coalition. They were always in their position, even though there was one moment when it was almost possible for them to join the ruling coalition, but it didn't work out. But they have run the Riga City Council since 2010. And then now 10 years later, and after many corruption scandals, they are very weak in Riga. The leader of the party, in the midst of these corruption scandals, he left the country he was elected. He decided to run for the European Parliament. And now Ushakov is a member of European Parliament. So the party lost its face to a certain extent. And the party has been collapsing. They have lost. It is disintegrating. They are facing difficulties with their main partners, which was the Godskalpot Latvia, Godskalpot Riga, another political party, which is kind of mixed Latvian Russian party. So they are facing a lot of problems, and the Riga City Council become dysfunctioning. So there are emergency elections. They were supposed to take place in spring. They will, because of the COVID situation, they were postponed. They will take place at the end of the summer. And so this is a very interesting moment, because these elections, it could be probably a moment when the Russian speakers of Riga, because there are Russian speakers who were upset about Harmony Center and the way how they are running the Riga city. And now probably even more, but we are going to see if the so-called Latvian parties, ethnic Latvian parties, in which you also do have ethnic Russians, but probably there are some of them, if these parties will find a way how to talk to the Russian speakers of Riga, who might be upset about the way how Harmony Center handled the municipal affairs, or is this ethnic divide going to persist? So it is an interesting moment. And it's probably a moment when this ethnic divide could be overcome in a deeper and much more meaningful way. We have seen what happened in Estonia, where EKRE, which is a far-right party, is a government coalition together with the Center Party, which was supposed to be a party that voiced the concerns about the Russian speaker situation in Estonia. So now they are in the same government coalition. So these ethnic divides seems to be less pronounced in Estonia, and we are going to see what's going to happen in Latvia.
Thank you, Una. Your article touches on this as well. I have a question from Michael Barron about the energy security issues, discussions around Nord Stream 2, Turk Stream, Russia's role, and Baltic energy security issues. Can you comment on that? You talk a little bit about this in your article as well, and I highly recommend that everyone check out that Orbis article.
Yeah, thank you. These are crucial questions. And this, as I say in my article, this Baltic energy dependency on Russia, which now has diminished, but it was something that was of Baltic own doing, because of some sort of a political laziness, because of the convenience, because of the existing ties between these 90s elites in the Baltic countries and Russian business circles. So the energy dependency has diminished over the years, but there is still certain problems that have to be faced and solved. The dependency has decreased on one hand because Lithuania, which was the most dependent on the Russian gas, took very decisive steps to reduce this dependency. And it happened after, to a certain extent, it was a response to, on one hand, these gas wars between Ukraine and Russia in late 2000s, and Russia and Belarus. On the other hand, it was a response, a certain anxiety in the Baltic societies after Russian war against Georgia. So these events in late 2000s was some sort of, on one hand, antagonized the Baltic societies, and they started to push more the political elites to seek other alternative energy sources than just the Russian gas, or to capitalize more on other existing sources that already did exist. For example, in the Latvian case.
So you both have done a lot of work, even for FPRI, on specifically Russian disinformation efforts, disinformation propaganda, attempts at interference. I feel like the Baltic states, along with other countries like Ukraine or Georgia, are some of the veteran recipients of this kind of Russian attempts of interference, and they've developed a lot of really great successful tactics in combating this. I have a question here. How do you see, sorry, I just lost that question. Yes, here we go. Are we seeing Russian interference in the political system in the same level we saw in the American presidential elections or British Brexit referendum? And on top of that, I want to add this question. Maybe each of you could tell us a little bit about some of your earlier research, some of the examples that you have shared with us of success stories of how the Baltic states have been combating disinformation.
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing that, at least in my perception, we have not seen anything like Russian interference in the American elections or the British Brexit referendum. There has just not been, there have been attempts, especially in the early 2000s, to instrumentalize the Russian-speaking community. The biggest crisis was the Estonian crisis with the Bronze Soldier Monument. But that was the last big crisis in Russian-Baltic relations and the last big Russian attempt to destabilize the situation in one of the Baltic states. Since then, on one hand, the Baltic states have become more resilient, and I think this resilience, in my perception, it comes from a deeper integration in the European Union and NATO, but especially European Union. And these international internalization of European norms in many different levels, they have reduced. They have the possibility of Russian influence, and I think in that sense, if we think about what could Ukraine learn from the Baltic states, or what could Georgia learn from the Baltic states, the problem is that Ukrainian-Georgian situation is different, in the sense that they are not members of the European Union. And that is problematic, because I think that what has helped the Baltic states enormously to change the political culture, to change the discourse around certain key issues. And then the other thing is that in my perception, the Baltic states are just luckily not that interesting for Russia. They have a much bigger fish to catch somewhere else. The reports of both Estonian and Latvian security services of these last couple of years, they say what Indra already mentioned, that this compatriots abroad policy has not worked very efficiently in the Baltic states. And especially in the Latvian case, the state security service says that Russia has problem appealing to the younger generation of the Russian speakers. And on one hand, it is a question of young Russian speakers in Latvia just not being that interested in the ideas coming from Moscow. On that hand, there is a certain laziness, lack of resources. Something is done, but in a not very efficient way regarding the promotion of this compatriots policy. So yeah, I think there is both. There is integration in the European Union and NATO, and then there is this just the situation in which in the context of what's happening in Syria, in the context of other Russian interests around the world, that the Baltic states are not the top priority right now.
And I would just mention also that the Baltics are kind of used to it a little bit in some ways, right? That used to some sort of propaganda, to hearing Russian television, or you know, they're building up their personal resilience as well. And this has also been kind of a big focus in education. The Stratcoms, or the NATO centers that are located in the Baltics as well, are pushing this kind of media literacy that is helping to identify, you know, kind of questionable sources, and so this is also kind of part of the discussion, is the personal resilience, in addition to the European integration, and what all that when I mentioned as well.
Thank you for that. I have a question from Chandler McOwen. I'm not familiar with this case. He says, the case of Niels Usakov's removal from the office. What are your thoughts on this and Russian influence in politics on a city level? I imagine maybe you're familiar with this case, but I haven't heard of it.
Niels Usakov's, has been kind of mired in these corruption scandals recently, particularly around Riga Satiksme, the transportation infrastructure in Riga, and it was kind of coming under fire from the Minister of the Environment, Minister of the Environment and
Regional Development. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and kind of during this episode, Niels Usakovs, who's was the mayor, longtime mayor of Riga, right, for 10 years or so, as Una mentioned, also was running a simultaneous sort of campaign for the European Parliament, which he kind of denies is connected to this investigation, but he has kind of successfully switched his own role, moved from being quite dominant in Riga city politics into the European Parliament. But maybe Una also spoke a little bit about this moment in time, right, where the kind of destabilization of Saskanya in Ushakov's party has opened up perhaps this moment in Riga city politics. And of course, Riga, it's important to note, right, has about 1/3 of the Latvian population. So it is more than just a capital city. It is more than just a city sort of situation, but it indeed has kind of quite broad ramifications in terms of the political environment in Latvia.
Yeah, he was, so yeah, Ushakov was removed from the office by the Minister of Regional Regional Development because of mishandling the finances of the public transportation company of the city. And then, as Indra explained, he ran for European elections, and he is now a member of the Parliament. And as I said, it's a huge loss for the Harmony Center, but he was really the face of the party. Even in the elections in which he was not running, the parliamentary elections, he was always on the election posters, because for many people, he was, if you were vote, and the slogan was, if you want to vote for Ushakovs, you have to vote for the party.
You're in Norway right now, right?
Yes.
And Indra is in Minneapolis. I'm here in Philadelphia. One of the reasons why we're using this format, yes, it's convenient and it's bringing us together, but one of the reasons why we're using this format is the current pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about how the Baltic states have been coping with the pandemic, what the situation is there right now, and if you're hearing of any projections where things might be headed in the region in terms of the spread of the pandemic?
Well, I think that the overall Baltic response to the pandemic was very efficient. So the measures were taken very early, and the measures consisted first of closing the borders. Latvia didn't close the borders, except the border with Russia, but Latvia closed basically all the transportation, including flights and transportation to Estonia and Lithuania. I think the Baltic states were very efficient in cooperating because on one hand, there has been a cooperation and consultation constantly on how to handle the crisis. On the other hand, the Baltic states very efficiently cooperated in bringing back Baltic citizens who were stuck abroad because of the travel disruptions and the closed borders. And I think I was very happy to see this. On one hand, this efficient response, on the other hand, this cooperation between three Baltic governments. There also has been constant consultations about the general sanitary crisis, the situation regarding the pandemic. The economy was partially closed, but not entirely. So there were certain businesses that were still running. It also depends on the country. So, but the Baltics managed to maintain some economic activity for small businesses and bigger businesses. The schools were closed. So the initial response was very efficient and very well coordinated. And the number of people who passed away from COVID are, of course, every person who passed away, it is a tragedy, but the numbers are still very low if we compare it to other countries. The number of cases were also, they remained low. The hospitals were not overwhelmed. Now it's the next step, and we are going, that's the same question that we are asking for every single country in Europe. What is going to happen now when the internal travels become more and more possible in European Union? And we see, unfortunately, a spike of cases again in the Baltic states. So we will see what is going to be the next response of the Baltic governments.
I think it might be worthwhile to underscore, as when I mentioned, this kind of Baltic cooperation, which in some areas on occasion has been flagging, especially if we're thinking about Real Baltica or some other points of cooperation. This was a real strong showing in terms of pan-Baltic approach, and I think that's worth noting. And also the kind of, in some ways, the international recognition is also an important sort of, right, in terms of a broader sort of foreign policy scale, that the Baltics were pretty quickly recognized as some of the countries who are able to manage the crisis pretty effectively, and they have made some of their resources more broadly known. So like they are one of the first first regions to have this. You work with the Google API in contact tracing technology on mobile phones that was, adhered to European standards, privacy standards. They also have had some successes in educational resources, kind of providing models for other countries on how to do some remote distance learning. And I think that's also kind of part of the discussion in some ways, that the Baltics have been able to kind of show some of the innovative approaches that could potentially be exportable to a broader sort of global community in dealing with the pandemic.
Indra, I'm glad you brought up the idea, this notion of Baltic collaboration. This is also a time of a lot of upheaval. Last summer was a very hot summer, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, in terms of uprisings, popular uprisings. Obviously, this summer, we're seeing a lot of turmoil here in the US as well. In August, it will be 31 years since the Baltic Human Chain event. You wrote about that for us last year, saying how much it mattered and the lessons it offered and the hope it offered, that event. Can you tell, especially for those of our audience members who are not familiar with this story, can you tell us a little bit about that experience? I think it will be a good way to complete the Q&A section.
Sure. So the Baltic Way, or the Baltic Train, was a demonstration in 1989 across the Baltic states, from the capital of Estonia, Tallinn, through to Riga, through to Vilnius. a physical chain of people kind of holding hands or holding flags and flowers and singing songs, folk songs, or whispering back and forth the words freedom up and down the chain in various languages. And of course, this happened on the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet Pact or Hitler-Stalin Pact, which basically kind of laid the foundation for the occupation, the annexation of the Baltic States during World War II. And this is kind of a kind of a culmination point of the Baltic singing revolution, the kind of path toward the reestablishment of independence. This year, perhaps it is even a little bit more poignant, this anniversary, not only the anniversary of the Baltic Way, but of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. If we're going to kind of turn back quickly to Russia, right, this is something that is kind of a hot topic right now as kind of Vladimir Putin is trying to rehabilitate in some ways this pact, and I think that Una can speak a little bit more to this, and to kind of reframe the historical context. So the idea of Baltic unity from 30 years ago to kind of now, I think, you know, maintaining that bloc has been politically important. It's been incredibly effective in kind of bringing the world's attention to the region without kind of having those partnerships. It becomes much more difficult for a country of 1.5 million or 2 million or 3 million to kind of draw the attentions of bigger countries, of bigger multilateral or multinational institutions. And so Baltic cooperation, I think, is going to continue to be quite necessary and quite powerful. And perhaps Una would like to add a little.
Well, thank you for that. I want to thank you both. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We still have a lot of questions, which I will share with you later, and hopefully will inspire some more Baltic bulletins at FPRI. I want to thank our attendees today. I want to thank our president, Riley Flynn, who has been in the audience this whole time. I want to thank many of our board members who I see have joined us today. Of course, many of our friends at the Baltic Initiative who are here. Those of you for whom FPRI is new, you're not yet a member, please join us, become a member of FPRI, consider becoming a donor of this organization that does such great research and important work, especially right now at this difficult time where we've all had to adapt to a very new way of running our organization. So thank you, Indra, thank you, Una, and we will continue this conversation through FPRI's Baltic Initiative online.